everyone, welcome back to INC Live and welcome to a new look recap show, this one for UFC 264. My name is Karl Bainbridge, I'm still the same, as is Luke Alexander, who is our guest, our guinea pig as it were, for a brand new format of this show. Luke, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Karl. This is a great card, I think, to debut this new format. We have a lot to talk about today.
Yes, I know there's a lot of people who do like tuning in for our recap shows. I want to explain a couple of reasons why we're deciding to do this. First and foremost, as Luke mentioned, UFC 264. This is the sort of card that really you need a lot more time. You need a lot more people to discuss the intricacies, especially surrounding that main event. And also as well from a more selfish perspective, I didn't really want to do a video considering what happened on the football by myself, because it would just be 10 minutes of me crying.
That makes sense. I mean, this was you had some bad and some good. Great card, and then football not so good. So we'll focus more on the UFC and try to get the football.
Yes, we'll try and forget about the Euros. World Cup's coming in just a year's time, so hopefully we'll get it done there. What we're going to be talking about, though, is UFC 264, and in particular, that main event. It was whiskey versus hot sauce. It was Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier once again. Let's get to the fights. And there is, of course, only one fight that we can start off with, which is the main event. Dustin Poirier beating Conor McGregor for a second time, this time by doctor stoppage at the end of the first round after Conor McGregor breaks his leg. Now, a lot of the hype surrounding this event, especially from Dana White, was that this was going to answer a lot of questions. Not only who is the better fighter between the two, is Conor McGregor still an elite level lightweight? What happens to the lightweight division? Has Conor learned some of those mistakes that led to the loss back in January? After 5 minutes of action, how many of those questions were answered?
I would say maybe one conclusively. I would say that it appears, at least as of right now, that Dustin Poirier is the better fighter over Conor McGregor. I don't know about you. I thought McGregor came out. I mean, he showed some different looks. You know, the spinning body kick, hook kick. Throwing a little bit more leg kicks. You know, like Poirier mentioned. I mean, he didn't really ever land any low calf kicks, but most of them were above the calf, like knee level. But I thought he provided some different looks. Towards the end, it appeared that he was rocked by Poirier, and then he chose to engage in the clinch, as many have laughed at. And then goes for the guillotine. And by the end of the first, I mean, he looked pretty fatigued on the ground. I don't know if you thought the same, but I mean, he looked like he kind of did the same thing as in the first fight with Poirier, and then similar facial and body language as the Khabib fight.
You touched on a really good point there in regards to Conor's attitude on the ground, because I actually think that if you compare to how he handled Dustin on the ground to how he handled Khabib, obviously, he would have prepared for it a lot more with Khabib being such a great grappler. I felt he was better at surviving against Khabib than he was against Dustin. I mean, Khabib never looked like finishing Conor with ground and pound in that fight, whereas Dustin did. And Dustin in the first round, when you bear in mind how good Conor normally is early on in the fight, I do agree with you. I think that I personally liked a lot of what Conor was doing in the stand-up. I liked the fact that he was mixing in the leg kicks. I liked the fact that he was bringing back some of the capoeira stuff that he was doing back when he was a featherweight. But I also thought it was quite a short-term approach. You maybe made the argument back in January that Conor was maybe playing it too safe, just being quite conservative when he fought Dustin. This was almost the opposite side of the spectrum, and he was going too hard to try and get the first round finish, which, bearing in mind how good Dustin is late on in the fight, was maybe the best suggestion. A lot of people have jumped on the guillotine attempt as sort of Conor's downfall. What was he doing trying to grapple with a guy like Poirier who has such a good ground game? I actually quite like that. I like the fact that Conor was willing to try and mix things up. That was something which, according to Kavanagh, they were looking to try and they were testing and training a couple of times during preparations for the fight. So I don't fault thinking outside the box. Because, I mean, if Conor pulls off that guillotine, if he gets Dustin down and submits him, everyone's jumping on his back saying, oh, congratulations, Conor McGregor, you've just invented the guillotine, and everyone's going to be trying to do the same thing in training camps.
Yeah, I agree. for Kavanaugh to say that, it was pretty surprising. I mean, I don't, anything, guillotine's a 50-50 move, especially pulling guard for a guillotine. I mean, any move that is a 50-50 payout or even less, going against a grappler like Poirier, I probably wouldn't want to concede the ground. If you're McGregor, not only does going to the ground probably means you're going to ride out and lose the rest of the round. He really hasn't been able to show any ability to get back up to his feet. He also has serious cardio issues that have been exposed by the ground. Most of the time he does go to the ground. I mean, the Mendez fight he was able to regain, to his feet and then finish Mendez. But, as far as lately goes, he's really not shown much promise, getting up after being grounded for a significant period of time. And I mean, I guess, it's so tough with McGregor because, I mean, he did blatantly cheat in this fight. He blatantly cheated in the Khabib fight with putting, fingers in the gloves. And I mean, that is the only reason Poirier did get up off of him, was because he was holding Poirier's glove and trying to pull him into up kicks. So, of a future fight down the road, I really hope they have someone in there other than Herb Dean who's able to stop that, because it's, if you have holes in your game, you can't cheat to patch those holes.
And the big irony was that Dustin letting Conor back to his feet maybe gave Conor that stand-up opportunity. Now, depending on who you believe, depending on what John Kavanagh says, what Conor says, what Dustin says, arguably in those final 10 seconds, that was when Conor threw the kick that led to the end of the fight.
Right. Yeah, it's tough to say. I mean, as as both, passionate consumers of MMA media, the check debacle has been explored so much already. There's so many YouTube videos breaking down, if there was a kick that was checked, if not, if it was the knee, if it was the elbow, if it was the front kick, if it was the leg kick. It's really tough to see. But, yeah, as far as the directionality of that fight, I mean, I don't know. What did you think? When McGregor got back up to his feet, he looked fatigued, but I mean, I don't think that he was totally done. But I mean, obviously, most judges, I think 2 of the 3 judges scored that a 10-8 round. So obviously, that would be a pretty substantial obstacle for him to come back to win that fight, apart from getting a finish.
I personally wouldn't have gone for a 10-8. I think the Conor showed enough to try and avoid that outcome. What I do think, though, was that had the fight gone into a second round, I don't see Conor coming back from it. I think Dustin would have started piling it on. I don't think it would have been like a one-shot knockout like the second fight. I think it would be a case of rocking Conor, having him up against the fence, and then Herb having to step in and say, that's it, I'm done.
I agree. I mean, this fight, if it showed me anything, was Conor's lack of durability. I mean, Dustin landed, the shots that Dustin landed to cause McGregor to clinch were not substantial shots. I mean, they landed pretty clean, but I mean, they were shots back in McGregor's heyday that he would have ate like nothing. I mean, McGregor used to be able to eat a ton of shots. Like, I mean, even as a featherweight, it wasn't like he was unhittable. He's always been, his left hook and the way that he leans over so much, he's used to catching a little bit. But yeah, I have serious concerns about his durability. And I don't know about you, but I feel like McGregor's in a pretty precarious position. In his last fight, he mentioned, he's really here to just continue making highlights. In these past 2 fights, he's made highlights, but maybe not the type of highlights that he wants.
I totally agree. And I think that a lot of people question when it's the right time for a fighter to maybe start winding down their career. Like, a lot of people have been sort of trying to put Conor in that same sort of bracket. Now, Conor is not, say, like a BJ Penn, for example. He's not reached that stage. But it's starting to become an issue. I say this for 2 reasons. One, I think the mystique of Conor McGregor is starting to fade. 2, the performances, he's lost a step compared to, say, the Dustin Poiriers, the Justin Gaethjes of the world, the Charles Oliveira's. That doesn't mean that he still can't beat good lightweights. I think if they ever did him versus, say, Tony Ferguson or Dos Anjos, I think Conor would have a good chance of winning those fights. But also as well, I think the star power, that the good feeling around Conor McGregor is also starting to fade. He can still pull decent numbers. I think if he ever does come back from this, he'll still pull another 1 million pay-per-view buys. But a lot more people are seeing him in a negative light. And that brings me on to some of the comments he made after the match was over.
Yes. I agree. Yeah, the comments he made, I mean, he made pretty awful comments before the fight as well. But I mean, I don't think Rogan should have interviewed him after, having a horrific, leg fracture. I mean, no one should be interviewed at that point. That doesn't, give him free ride to say what he did say. But yeah, I mean, pretty classless comments. I mean, he said stuff in the past before in the Aldo fights and the Khabib fights, that did drum up controversy and were way farther than, most fighters apart from your Colby Covingtons will go. But yeah, it's disappointing. I mean, like you said, he's losing his mystique. His trash talk isn't as well written anymore. He's just really losing his mystique. I mean, he hasn't won a fight in forever. I think this was a terrible outcome for him, and I would rather see him fight, like you said, a more winnable matchup and maybe get 2 wins before you fight Poirier again. Because going into the fourth fight with Poirier and losing, what is your legacy after that?
In a strange way, I actually think that the outcome of this fight, I mean, I'm not going to say that someone breaking their leg is a good thing, but when you listen to what Dana White has said, he says that Dustin Poirier versus Charles Oliveira will happen for the title next, but he also said Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor 4 will happen when Conor's ready. So you could realistically have a situation where Dustin Poirier beats Charles Oliveira, which at this point I think he will, and Conor McGregor fights for the lightweight title against Dustin Poirier in that 4th fight. The guy has lost 2 fights in a row to the same guy and could very realistically be getting himself another title shot.
I mean, it's pretty disgusting, as far as like the lightweight division goes. I mean, if we have an ascendant Makachev or, Gaethje comes back and gets another win, in between that, I mean, it would be insane to give a guy who has not won a fight in the lightweight division in years a title shot. But I mean, money speaks, and that's made sense going. But, like I said, at least if I'm McGregor's manager, I want to at least get a win. I want another highlight. I want something to show that our guy has something. Because, I mean, McGregor's not stupid. I mean, he might be crazy. I think he has at least an idea. I mean, every fighter's confident. But, I mean, coming out of the last 2 fights with Poirier, not much success. Not much to really go off of. I mean, he's going to be more hesitant to throw kicks now with the broken leg. The kicks were arguably, the better part of this 3rd fight, at least for McGregor. He landed the left hand on the level change feint that Poirier threw. And I mean, that's great. But I don't think his power is carried up enough to 155 to have the one-hitter quitter power that he did at 45. I don't see where he patches the holes in his game to overcome and beat Poirier. So, yeah, I don't know. He's in a weird position. He has so much money. He could easily retire right now and go off and ride off into the sunset. And I think people would still probably respect him. And you would have plenty of McGregor fans who would say he would have won that fight if he wouldn't have broken his leg. But I think if you fight the 4th fight and you lose in dominant fashion again via stoppage, you've lost a lot of the shine off of your legacy.
Big issue that I have with Conor in that regard, though, is that like a lot of people have been using Ronda as the main comparison. Obviously, Ronda and Conor are such big stars. With Ronda, you had someone who recognised quite quickly the sport had passed her by and then decided, hey, I'm going to move into a new field. She had a lot of success there, and now she's starting her own family and just seems to enjoy being away from the spotlight. Conor's the opposite. Conor seems to enjoy the sort of fame and the glamour that comes with fighting. And he's also a very proud man. I don't think he would be as open to accepting that the sport has passed him by. And you could see the situation maybe like a Chuck Liddell did, where he just keeps going and going because he wants that last win. He just enjoys that adrenaline rush of fighting, and loss after loss after loss. That could... I know there's a lot of Conor fans that are going to be watching this, and I do apologise, but that is a realistic possibility of what could happen to Conor. This is not the same guy he was that destroyed Eddie Alvarez.
Yes, and I mean, for the Conor fans, I mean, he needs a win. He needs to, if he really wants to heal up and come back, he needs to win against legitimate competition. He really does. Like, he just needs to get back. I mean, with a win, I think that, people forgive the stuff that he said in the Poirier fight. I mean, he has, the opportunity to rewrite the wrongs and, like he loves to do, put out another highlight. apart from that, I mean, his name, like you said, his name, no matter what, has stayed pretty consistently good throughout this whole time. I mean, it's very well he could leave, the UFC and do more of the, celebrity style boxing. I mean, he has great hands. I mean, obviously, boxing Floyd Mayweather didn't work out, but I mean, it's, the best ever. He could box other people. He could go into other ventures, that are still sports and competition related. But as far as the lightweight division goes, I just don't know if that's a great division for him. I mean, he's mentioned not wanting to cut back down to featherweight, but I mean, if he really has the itch still, I would be interested to see if he could do it. I don't know if he can, but
I did notice that the bookies have opened a book on Conor's next opponent, and Jake Paul was the second favorite.
yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, everyone's acting like it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to heal up and just, be back to fight shape. I mean, this is a very grievous injury that he suffered, and not everybody is a Chris Weidman. So, I used to love the guy. I wish the best for him. I hope he has a great recovery and, hopefully, I mean, in my humble opinion, I think he needs to get a win and he needs to get a new camp. If not totally a new camp, just get some different looks, get some different sparring and training partners, like just inject something different. I think he's, he's at a point in his career where he's at a real crossroads.
The discussion about Conor McGregor could continue ad nauseum for the next 3 or 4 weeks or so. What we're going to do, though, is going to be talking about some of the rest of the card. Now, there's plenty of stories, plenty of big moments from this card, which we could be discussing in a lot more detail. For you, Luke, in particular, what do you think was the second biggest storyline coming out of this card?
We will get to some of the finishes. Some of the finishes were great, but I mean, they were in fights that weren't as big fights for their respective divisions. I mean, the co-main event was not a great fight, but I think it was an interesting fight because it didn't really give us much to go off of in the welterweight division. We had what's virtually a top contender fight. And I was very surprised to see that fight played out the way that it did. I thought that in his past few fights, Wonderboy had been a little bit more aggressive, wins against Jeff Neal and Vicente Luque, Gilbert Burns' training partner. He looked to be a different Wonderboy. Like, I mean, he was mixing in a little bit more volume compared to his older fights. He was a little bit more tentative with his fight with Gilbert Burns, and I think that he felt Gilbert's strength early, and Gilbert was able to do what no one was able to do for Wonderboy for a while, which was, consistently get him to the cage and take him down. Gilbert wasn't really able to do much with top control. It was kind of a weird area of the cage where they were, kind of up against the cage to where Gilbert really couldn't work on top of him or get any, dominant position. And then, the end of the fight is kind of marred by Gilbert, repeatedly hammer fisting Wonderboy in the back of the head. But I think that this fight's interesting in the fact that it really didn't give us a top contender for Kamaru Usman, and Colby Covington is kind of still hanging in the mix.
Which I don't 100% agree with, considering that Colby's last win was against Tyron Woodley, who's no longer in the UFC, but that's an argument for another day. I actually came out of this fight with a lot more respect for Gilbert than I did going into it. I mean, I have enjoyed Gilbert Burns' rise up the rankings, and I personally picked him to beat Usman going into 258. But at the same time, I also thought, how good were his wins? Well, you bear in mind that he beat Damian Maia, who is pretty much on his way out of the UFC and also 40 years old. Tyron Woodley, who, as mentioned, was shot by that point. I think the Wonderboy win, even though Stephen Wonderboy Thompson is 38 years old, I think this win is much more of a sign of how good Gilbert Burns is than the other two were. So I give him a lot of praise because Wonderboy was always praised for his takedown defense, the way he could just stuff the wrestling and the ground game of so many great grapplers. And yet he was Gilbert Burns, who he made it look easy at times, the way he was taking down Wonderboy.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was tough for me because I don't know if I would say it was a good performance by Burns or a bad performance by Wonderboy. I've always ranked Burns pretty highly. I know he had his issues at lightweight, and he has shown issues with durability. He's been knocked out, but I mean, he fought a pretty competitive fight for as long as it lasted with Usman. And, as far as Stephen Thompson goes, you either edge him out in a really, really competitive striking match as Till did, you spark him out like Anthony Pettis, or you're an athletic freak like Woodley and you're able to, kind of fight to a stalemate. But, yeah, Burns was able to get in and do what in 3 rounds not many others were able to do, even if Wonderboy is 38. So, yeah, I'm interested to see where Burns goes from here. I haven't heard much from Wonderboy. I mean, at 38, this was probably his last chance to, fight for the title again. So I wouldn't see him, sticking around too much longer. But I'm interested to see where Burns goes from here.
Some of the other big things on the main card as well. Sean O'Malley, another knockout finish. Question marks over whether Herb Dean was right to stop the fight against Kris Moutinho. Not a competitive matchup. Despite that, though, it's almost a strange situation where Sean O'Malley completely dominates this fight. There's no question over who the winner is. And even despite that, he arguably comes out of the fight with a lower stock than his opponent did.
Yeah, he did. And I mean, his opponent didn't land all that much on him, but I mean, it showed more holes in Sean's game. I mean, Sean had to stay in there a little bit longer. We saw that Sean really doesn't like leg kicks. I mean, Sean seemed very uncomfortable anytime a leg kick landed. It's a guy who's had previous issues with his legs. And then obviously, Moutinho's pressure provided a unique foil for what Sean's style is. So, ideally, Sean would have had him out of there in the first round when he had him severely rocked. It was, right down to the end of the round, and Moutinho's able to get away and survive. So, I mean, if you're the O'Malley camp, you're kind of, frustrated that you weren't able to get him out of the first round. But, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Moutinho's a tough as nails guy. I mean, 9-5, not the greatest record, but, I mean, hopefully he gets at least one more fight in the UFC. And, I mean, O'Malley versus Font's a pretty interesting fight, and I'm definitely leaning towards Font in that fight.
Speaking of Rob Font, I actually read somewhere that in the aftermath of 264, Kris Moutinho already has more Twitter followers than Rob Font does.
That's absurd. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, he's been on a much more watched event. And I mean, Moutinho was very smart. I mean, he had the lime green hair. I mean, it was a very interesting thing to watch get punched for, 2.5 rounds. So, yeah, I mean, hopefully I'm really happy to hear also Moutinho received a bonus.
Yes.
Because I think it was $17K show money. I mean, that's disgusting.
In terms of other things, was there anything else on the not on the main card, but on the rest of the card, in the prelims, the rest of the main card fights that stood out for you?
It was great to see Tai Tuivasa get a win over Greg Hardy. Many members of the MMA media mentioned it, but I mean, Greg Hardy has not had a win. Now, every one of Greg Hardy's wins comes against opponents who are no longer in the UFC. Greg Hardy, awful criminal past. I really hope he gets cut. I think this kind of shows his ceiling. I mean, granted, he did rock Tuivasa before, being finished himself. But, yeah, I mean, I think Greg Hardy's a bad look for the UFC, and I don't think he should be in the UFC anymore. So I was very happy to see Tai Tuivasa get that knockout. Irene Aldana continuing her rise. I mean, she's someone who I'm very interested in the bantamweight division, and I think over time she's began to flourish. I mean, she's someone almost like a Chukagian, like we talked about before. I think a lot of these women fighters who are a little bit more new, they have great striking fundamentals. They didn't have the power before, but Aldana's really been sitting down on her shots. I mean, she sat down on that left hook and, put Kunitskaya on her butt. So I'm really looking forward to see Aldana continue her rise. I mean, she's someone who could provide a really interesting challenge to Nunes. I think that Aldana has a lot of power and maybe might even have a technical edge in her boxing over Nunes.
And she's long for the weight class as well. Very long.
She is great.
Like, honestly, I would.
What about you?
Honestly, I would love to see Aldana versus GDR. I think that could be a fantastic strikers match.
I agree. I think it would be a really interesting kickboxing versus boxing match. And, Aldana didn't have the best fight against Holmes. She mentioned, that she had COVID and had an injury. But, yeah, I would love to see. It would be a great fight to see where Aldana is right now. Arguably, GDR gave Nunes one of her best fights in past memory. So, if Aldana is able to get past Jermaine Durandame, it could definitely show that she could be a challenge to Nunes.
In terms of me, for the other prelim fights that stuck out for me, Ilia Topuria. A lot of people had Ryan Hall down as almost this hoodoo man of the featherweight division. Like, because nobody saw, he was such a tricky opponent to face, but you didn't get much upside from beating him. He completely starched Ryan Hall. And he's 11-0, 12-0 now? He's one to watch out for in that division.
I love Topuria. I mean, I side with Ed Gallo and the Fight Site guys. I mean, Topuria is one of my favorite prospects. When this match was made, I was salivating because this is what I pretty much saw. You know, we've seen Hall in fights not be punished for, you know, the Granby or the roles that he does. But yeah, I think Topuria fought, in my opinion, a perfect fight. He engaged when he needed to engage. When Hall gave up his back, he would sneak in and catch him with shots. You know, and then finally Hall went to post with one arm. Topuria trapped the post arm under him and just teed off with ground and pound. Like you said, this is a thankless fight. You know, Topuria winning this fight, it's a great win. I think Hall was on a 6-fight win streak. So I mean, you snap Hall's 6-fight win streak. Hall had beaten, you know, B.J. Penn, Gray Maynard, some notable names in there.
Darren Elkins.
But yeah, Darren Elkins. Topuria is 11-0, and I would love to see him face, you know, some higher ranked competition after this.
And I'm going to give it praise because nobody else seems to. Jessica Eye versus Jennifer Maia was an absolute war. And I know that Jessica Eye has a lot of critics, a lot of people who think she's not worthy of being in the UFC. The state of her face by the end of that fight. Like, I know that OMalley versus Moutinho got fight of the night, which I'm happy for in regards to Kris, but that to me was a contender because that was brutal.
Man, it was. And I mean, Jessica Eye had just no quit in her, walking into counters repeatedly. And, you know, her style is not pretty. It's not the most technical, but I mean, she lands just by virtue of coming forward. And, you know, I mean, she was disappointed. I was 50-50. It was a tough fight to score. You know, it depends on, honestly, I think I could have won at a different place with different judges based on, you know, how you score counter fighting. I think Maia was landing more in some rounds going backwards. And then, you know, I was the one pressing forwards most of the time. But yeah, what a great fight. I mean, I has really made herself, you know, a high action, interesting fighter. Even to fight against Calderwood, she really brought the fight against Calderwood. Ultimately, that was a loss as well against another counter fighter. But yeah, I was happy for Eye, and I really was wishing that, you know, she was going to get fight of the night or something for that. I mean, like you said, I mean, it was kind of a sleeper. Many thought the fight would be boring from the beginning, but yeah, Maia looked good as well. I think that, you know, she's going to be a constant presence in that division.
And on that note, we'll call it the end of the day. On the whole, if you had to give sort of like a schoolyard grade for UFC 264, how would you score it?
Man, schoolyard grade, we'll go out of 5. I would give this a solid 3.5 out of 5. I thought that there were some viral moments. You know, the Moutinho O'Malley fight was an interesting moment. There were people, my friends that didn't even watch the UFC, who were at bars or might have watched the fight for McGregor, were asking me about, you know, the Moutinho and the O'Malley guy. Who are these guys? You know, these guys are hilarious. You had great knockouts. You know, the Hardy fight provided a great knockout. And then the main event, even though it ended in kind of a strange thing, I mean, it was still got people talking. It was very viral. I mean, for days, you know, at least the second day, you know, even now there's still people tweeting about Conor's leg. So I thought it was a great event put on by the UFC. And, you know, on paper, it might not have looked like the best card ever before, but I think it worked out great the night of. What do you think?
I'm in the same boat. I would personally go for 4 out of 5. I think that, as you mentioned before, I think that there was a lot of stories which came out of nearly every fight on this card. And that's a big thing I look for. I'm maybe more media orientated than what some of the other people are who follow the sport. But like, obviously, we've got the fallout from the Conor fight. What's going to happen with him? We've got, obviously, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, some of the questions over his future. Tai Tuivasa. I mean, Greg Hardy getting knocked out by a guy who came in dancing to the Spice Girls. Now, that's the sort of meme-style story that attracts new fans. I think on the whole, fantastic card. Just fingers crossed that the UFC can try and keep this momentum going with 265. That being said, you look at the main event, some of the sort of issues that people have with the main event, which we've discussed ad nauseum on this channel. I question whether or not they'll be able to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you obviously, you know, not as much momentum as having a McGregor fight. What are there only like 3 fights announced or 4 fights announced for that?
Something like that, yeah.
So. Yeah, so I mean, we'll see. I mean, I definitely think. I mean, when I went to the last Houston, that one's obviously in Houston as well. That's the Derek Lewis one, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, Houston's a crazy crowd. I mean, they could put some people on there that I think would definitely boost the profile of that crowd. Derek Lewis is a very viral figure. I mean, there's a lot of people that I know who don't follow UFC who know who Derek Lewis is. So, if you're the UFC promo team, I definitely think playing off of Derek Lewis. I mean, Gane is a pretty unknown commodity outside of, really, really hardcore fans, but I think really leaning into Derek Lewis could maybe help them out on that card.
And we'll discuss that card in a lot more detail in a few months. Not a few months, it'll be completely out of date. A few weeks' time, UFC 265. I hope, Luke, you'll be with me again to talk about that card, the fallout from it in a lot more detail.
Yeah, I'd love to.
And I hope that you'll be tuning in as well. This is the new format for the show. We'll probably go back to normal for the UFC Fight Night Makhachev versus Moises. Of course, featuring Miesha Tate's comeback, which is gonna be very intriguing to see. I'll be discussing that on my own, same time in the next 7 days. For now, though, this is the end of the INC recap show for UFC 264. My name's been Karl Bainbridge. That's been Luke Alexander.
Thanks for having me, Carl.
Like, share, subscribe, ring the bell so you'll never miss a video. This is the INC. Thank you for watching.